What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through and updating our Dynasty Fantasy Football quarterback rankings here as we approach the 2025 offseason. We're going to be going through each of the positions here later this week, but like I said, today is the quarterback. So if this is your first time on the channel, make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you find something interesting, entertaining, or actionable. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about some quarterbacks. All right, so I got the tier maker pulled up on the screen. We got 7 tiers to get through all 30 quarterbacks here in today's video, and we are going to be kicking it off here in tier 1. I only got 2 guys. These are your MVP candidates, Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. Now, both of these guys have been incredible fantasy football assets over the last 12 months. Both of these guys, obviously, like I've mentioned, are in the MVP conversation. No other players really at the quarterback position have been averaging the fantasy points per game that these guys have been averaging. You got 25.6 from Lamar, 22.7 from Josh Allen. Josh Allen still gets the edge as the #1 quarterback in my rankings, just because if you look at the last 2 to 3 years, Josh Allen has continuously finished as the quarterback 1 in fantasy football. But he and Lamar are definitely the top 2 players in my quarterback rankings and in a tier of their own. Now let's move on to tier 2. Tier 2, I'm going to have 4 quarterbacks. I got Jayden Daniels, the rookie, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, and Patrick Mahomes. Now we can talk a little bit about all of these guys. Jayden Daniels, to me, he's a player that the play in year 1 as a rookie has already earned himself the quarterback 3 in my rankings, the top of tier 2. 24 years old, averaging 21.5 fantasy points per game. This is a player who I only expect to continue to improve at the NFL level. The Commanders have a ton of cap space next year. They might be able to get him some additional weapons here on offense, and you think about that year 2 where he could take a step forward. The age in itself is already enough for me to move him up, because the rest of the guys in this tier are 26, 28, 29 years old. When you look at Patrick Mahomes there at the end, he is a guy that I think with the rushing upside, the passing upside, is a top 3 quarterback in Dynasty Fantasy Football. Now, Jalen Hurts comes in at number 4. He is the second youngest of this tier. I think he still needs to be a top 4 guy. This is a guy who has the rushing upside. We've seen the worries about the tush push going away with Jason Kelce gone. Those didn't matter here in 2024. It's a guy who's still going to get the rushing upside. He's going to get the rushing touchdowns. People are going to say he's not that great of a passer or he needs to improve as a passer. That doesn't really matter for the fantasy football points. He's still the franchise quarterback for the Eagles, and he's still going to score fantasy football points. This is a top 4 guy in my rankings. Joe Burrow is a guy who I think saw his value increase in 2024. We obviously saw some of those injury concerns going into the year where people were worried about the wrist. It didn't seem to matter by the end of the year. Joe Burrow was going crazy, scoring a ton of fantasy football points. Obviously, Jamar Chase got the triple crown. I think Joe Burrow has surpassed Patrick Mahomes in Dynasty Fantasy Football rankings, and it shows up when you look at the fantasy points per game too. He averaged 22.5 fantasy points per game. Yes, he's 28. That's still not old for the quarterback. Doesn't matter to me, a top 5 QB. And then Patrick Mahomes still finds himself in tier 2 for me. A little bit of a down year for him, was only averaging 18.4 fantasy points per game, and he is 29 years old, going to be going into his 30-year-old season next year. But the reason why you have Patrick Mahomes in this tier is because of the solidified value that Patrick Mahomes is always going to have. He is never going to see himself fall below the top 10. This is a guy whose name value is going to be significantly high. His play on the field is always going to be pretty high as well. 18.4, like I said, it was a pretty bad year for Mahomes in Mahomes standards. But if you look at the guys that I have in tier 3, he averaged more fantasy points per game than all of them. So there really isn't an argument for him to be in the next tier down below, in my opinion. You have the value insulation with Mahomes' name. You have the production still. And maybe with Rashee Rice back on the football field next year, who he did lose for a good chunk of the year this year, and Hollywood Brown didn't play for a good chunk of the year this year. Hopefully he takes a little bit of a step forward again next year. Now going on to my tier 3, I got 5 quarterbacks in this tier. We'll kick it off at Justin Herbert, followed by Caleb Williams, CJ Stroud, Drake Maye, and Jordan Love. That's my entire tier 3. Now, this is a tier of players that I believe are going to be a very solid low-end QB1 type of quarterbacks over the next couple of seasons. I think all of these guys have the ability to take that step into that next tier, but we need to see some significant improvement, maybe some breakouts as far as the fantasy points per game goes. Justin Herbert, there is no doubt that Justin Herbert exceeded the expectations this year. There was a lot of concern about the Harbaugh offense and Greg Roman being here and how he wasn't going to throw the football. Didn't really matter. 17 fantasy points per game. He's still 26 years old. going to be 27 going into next year. This is a player that is still a cornerstone asset in Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues. You're still going to be building around Justin Herbert and comes in as a top 7 QB in my rankings. Caleb Williams is another player that I think a lot of people are probably going to look at this ranking and say, how can you put Caleb Williams over CJ Stroud? How can you put him over Jordan Love? How can you put him over Drake Maye? Because I think even the market wants Drake Maye to be ahead of Caleb Williams. I'm still believing in the talent. We just saw that they hired Ben Johnson there in Chicago. I think that's going to significantly help Caleb Williams with a better offensive-minded head coach in the building, calling better plays for Caleb Williams. And still a guy that's just 23 years old. I think there's a lot of room for growth from Caleb Williams. We know how good the offense is going to be. And really, when I look at the fantasy points per game, Caleb Williams outproduced every single player in this tier except for Justin Herbert and Jordan Love from a fantasy points per game perspective. So yes, some people are going to say, hey, you're a little bit too high on Caleb Williams. I don't care. I'm ranking him off of the potential and what I think is going to happen over the next couple of months. I think Caleb Williams is a fine player and a top 10 Dynasty Fantasy Football quarterback. Now, CJ Stroud and Drake Maye are both quarterbacks that I'm definitely still interested in having as cornerstone assets as well. Top 10 guys in my rankings. They're both 23 and 22 years old. They both averaged about 13.4, 13.7 fantasy points per game this year. I think both of these guys can take a step forward next year. We obviously saw that year 2 regression from CJ Stroud, but it also doesn't help when Stephon Diggs is injured for the majority of the year. Tank Dell gets hurt. Nico Collins goes on IR for a short stint. Joe Mixon out for some time. The offensive line for the Texans banged up. You get what I'm getting at here. I think CJ Stroud will be a little bit better going into year 3, and I still think I'm comfortable with him as my QB1 on my Dynasty Fantasy Football teams. The same thing can be said for Drake Maye. There's probably going to be some improvement here. Vrabel into the building as the head coach. Hopefully they get him an alpha wide receiver 1, whether that be via free agency or the NFL draft and a guy like Ted McMillan. I think Drake Maye could do wonders in year 2. We've seen the rushing upside with Drake Maye, and he's a player that I'm still excited about as well. And Jordan Love, this is a guy I think that a lot of the hype going into 2024 has now kind of died down for Jordan Love. We didn't see the best year from him. I still think the numbers were fine. Obviously 16 fantasy points per game, 26 years old. These are the things you want to look for in a quarterback in Dynasty leagues. I think he's going to be just fine. The offense around him, the play calling with LaFleur, those are going to be things that we can lean on. Is Jordan Love ever going to get into that Mahomes tier? Maybe, maybe not. I would lean probably not at this point, but I am still comfortable with him as a QB1, still coming in as my top 12 and a tier 3 type of talent here in my rankings. Now we're going to go to tier 4. Tier 4, I have a total of 6 quarterbacks, and we're going to be kicking it off with Bo Nix, followed by Kyler Murray, Brock Purdy, Baker Mayfield, Jared Goff, and Trevor Lawrence. Now this tier kind of consists of some older guys who had high fantasy points per game this year. They had good years in Jared Goff and Baker Mayfield. You have some younger guys that are a little bit kind of on the fringe of low-end QB1, high-end QB2. I think that's Bo Nix and Brock Purdy and Kyler Murray. Those are the kind of the guys. The reason why a lot of these players are in tier 4 is because, yes, even though some of them outproduced the players in tier 3, my confidence level with them just isn't as strong as tier 3. Bo Nix, an incredible rookie year, averaging 19 fantasy points per game. He's going to be 25 years old next year. I think Sean Payton and Bo Nix were a match made in heaven. We talked about earlier in the offseason how Sean Payton said this was his #1 quarterback, and at the time I said this was a bluff. I still think he was kind of bluffing, but it doesn't matter. It looks like this was his #1 pick because the way he made Bo Nix look in his rookie year has been incredible. I think Bo Nix showed more rushing upside than people imagined coming into his rookie season, and this is a player who, if they go in and get some more weapons on this offense, I think he can maybe even take another step forward. It's going to be a little bit harder for the Broncos to improve the offense than it is for teams like the Patriots and the Commanders who have a ton of cap space, but I think they can still do it here in Denver. We'll see what happens in year 2, but Bo Nix, you should still be comfortable with him as a fringe quarterback 1. Kyler Murray is coming off of a down year, still averaged 18 fantasy points per game. I think year 2 with Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be better for Kyler Murray. I know a lot of people are kind of out on Kyler at this point. You either love him or you hate him. I think for me, Kyler Murray is still a guy who's a fringe QB1, kind of teetering between that QB1 and that QB2 territory. I'm still more than comfortable with him as my QB1, and I think with the rushing upside and another year of experience with Marv, we can probably see some improvement going into 2025. Brock Purdy, this is a player who averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game this year. Still did that without Brandon Ayuk on the football field. Deebo Samuel banged up at times. Christian McCaffrey not on the football field either. I think Brock Purdy has earned the contract to be the franchise quarterback for the Niners. I think Kyle Shanahan has already come out and said that. that, Brock Purdy to me, this is a safe high-end QB2 in Dynasty leagues. Same can be said for Baker Mayfield and Jared Goff. Those guys' fantasy points per game were actually better than all of the other guys in this list, but their age being 29.8 years old for Baker and 30.3 years old for Jared Goff, that knocks them down in my rankings just a little bit. Obviously, in Dynasty Fantasy Football, youth isn't everything, but it is something that we should be considering when we're building these rosters for the long term. Guys like Jared Goff and Baker Mayfield, even though they're not necessarily old, kind of like guys like Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers and those guys, they are not young like guys like Jayden Daniels and Bo Nix and some of these other players as well. So they kind of are in this middle territory where they're not old, they're not young, but because of that, they've been moved down my rankings just a tiny bit. I still like these guys, but the age is definitely a little bit of a knock. And now last but not least, Trevor Lawrence in this tier. This is a player that I will be completely honest with you guys, I'm having a hard time completely writing off. I think Trevor Lawrence hasn't shown that he is the generational quarterback that people have written him up to be when he was coming into the NFL. Right now, sitting in my rankings as my quarterback 17, that definitely puts him in QB2 territory. Last year, averaged just 15.2 fantasy points per game, but he's only 25 years old. We saw Bryant Thomas Jr. break out in year one as a rookie. Maybe they bring in another coach this offseason that improves the play calling, kind of helps Trevor Lawrence get back to the things that make him a solid quarterback. And I think because of that, he has to stay in this tier 4. Could you argue that he is in tier 5? I definitely think you could, but for me, I can't do it right now. I still think there's just a little bit of potential in Trevor Lawrence that hasn't been unlocked. So he is the last player in my tier 4. Let's go to tier 5. Tier 5, I have 4 quarterbacks in here, and this is kind of my unknown tier. I have JJ McCarthy at the top of the tier, followed by Tua Tagovailoa, Michael Penix Jr., and Dak Prescott. Now, I think that there's some producers in this tier. Tua Tagovailoa averaging 17 fantasy points per game. Dak Prescott, we've seen him be a producer when he's healthy. He obviously didn't have the healthy year this year. But then you kind of have the unknowns of guys like JJ McCarthy, who I think we've seen with Sam Darnold in that Minnesota Vikings offense this year, that JJ McCarthy, his ceiling has to be pretty high with head coach Kevin O'Connell calling the plays. Michael Penix Jr., we saw some flashes late in the year, specifically that last game against the Carolina Panthers. He's a player that I didn't really love coming into the NFL draft, but for the majority, we still haven't seen enough at the NFL level to really make a strong opinion on Michael Penix. So that's why this tier is kind of the unknown. Tua Tagovailoa, we can talk about the risk of the concussions, but I really just don't want to get into that. That makes him very risky in my opinion. It does make him part of this unknown tier, and I think if there wasn't any of the concussion concerns, you would definitely be seeing Tua Tagovailoa in my tier 4, but those concerns alone make me want to have him here in the tier 5. And Dak Prescott, I love Dak Prescott as a fantasy asset. We've seen him have good years and bad years. It kind of seems like he's on and off, but at the end of the day, he's a little bit undervalued currently to me. The age, 31 and a half years old, going into his 32-year-old season, and a change of coaching in Dallas. I've seen small rumors of potentially a quarterback change in Dallas. There's a little bit of unknown with Dak Prescott, but Dak Prescott, I think, is one of the best veteran buys at the quarterback position currently, because I think when he's healthy, when he's on the football field, this is a guy who can give you those fringe QB1, high-end QB2 numbers. Let's move on to tier 6. Tier 6 has 3 quarterbacks. We're going to talk about Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson, and Sam Darnold. Now, this tier, Bryce Young, we did see a step forward in the second half of last year's games. Still a player who's just 23 years old. He averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game. I think going into next year with Dave Canales, they're comfortable with Bryce Young as the quarterback. I think there was a little bit of uncertainty earlier in the year. That little bit of uncertainty, the benching and some of that other stuff, it does make me slightly nervous long term. Will they do it again? I don't know, but at the end of the day, he did play well in the back half of the season, and I think this is a player who has the ability to go into year 3 and make another step forward. The issue is what weapons are going to be around him. Jonathan Brooks injured, most likely not going to play most of 2025, if any at all. Leggett, I think, is a fine wide receiver, not a great wide receiver. Then you have guys like Jalen Coker, who I think is a good wide receiver as well, but Adam Thielen, what is he going to be on this roster long term? I don't know. There's just a lot of question marks. The offense isn't that great around Bryce Young, but he did look decent at the end of the year, so I do have him at the top of the tier. Now, Anthony Richardson is another curious case as well. This is a player who did get benched in the middle of the year, and then he finished the year as the starter again. He's still only 22 years old. The rushing upside is still there for Anthony Richardson, but it feels like he's still just a raw prospect that really hasn't learned at the NFL level yet. Averaging 16 fantasy points per game this year, that's decent, not great. I think a lot of people who drafted Anthony Richardson are pretty disappointed with that year from him. I think that there's going to be some potential concerns about A-Rich moving forward. We've already heard that they might bring in some competition to compete with A-Rich to be the starting quarterback next year. Shane Steichen, his job will probably be on the line next year if they can't figure this out. So even though the raw talent of Anthony Richardson probably looks like it's going to have more fantasy football point potential than a guy like Bryce Young, I think the uncertainty around Anthony Richardson puts him behind Bryce Young in my rankings. And then good old Sam Darnold. Who would have thought at the beginning of the year we'd be talking about Sam Darnold in the same breath as Anthony Richardson? It certainly is not me. Now, Sam Darnold, he's 27 years old. He's certainly not old by any means. He averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game this year. A lot of the conversation about Sam Darnold is going to be, does Minnesota resign him for another year where he does get to come in and be the quarterback while JJ McCarthy still sits on the bench? Or does Sam Darnold take the payday and go play for another team where he could make the money, but maybe the offense isn't as friendly as it was in Minnesota? I think Sam Darnold will certainly be a starting quarterback next year. I don't believe it'll be in Minnesota. I believe it'll be somewhere else. I certainly think Minnesota is the best case scenario for Sam Darnold, but Sam Darnold, he is going to be a starting quarterback in 2025, and I think is a guy we should still be looking at as a pretty risky fantasy football asset. And now let's go on to my final tier, tier 7. I got a total of 6 quarterbacks in this tier, and this is a lot of the old guys. Matthew Stafford, Geno Smith, Russell Wilson, Justin Fields, Derek Carr, and Kirk Cousins. Really, Justin Fields is the only player in this tier not in his 30s, 26 years old, averaged 12 fantasy points per game this year. Obviously, that number was dragged down a little bit because they did have him playing in on some of these games where Russell Wilson was the starter, but Justin Fields, he's a player that I think maybe could get an opportunity to play elsewhere next year, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's just a backup quarterback either. That's why I can't confidently throw him into the Bryce Young and the Anthony Richardson tier, because I just don't believe enough teams are convinced that he's a starting quarterback at the NFL level. Now, Matthew Stafford, Geno Smith, Russell Wilson, Derek Carr, Kirk Cousins, they're all kind of in the same boat to me. They all kind of average that 14 to 16 fantasy points per game, but all of these guys are in their final years, I think, of their NFL careers. Stafford's probably pondering retirement. Geno, he may not be the starter for the Seahawks much longer. They may be looking at other options here eventually. Russell Wilson, probably the same thing. He's a free agent this year. Kirk Cousins is going to have to get released and enter free agency as well. Maybe he gets another starting job. And then Derek Carr, likely not going to be the long-term answer for the New Orleans Saints. I think all these quarterbacks, the older ones at least in this tier, are potentially guys that could be replaced within the next 2 seasons on their current NFL rosters. If that happens to any of them, I would not be surprised, but in the meantime, they're very cheap veteran buys that you can plug in during bye weeks, or best case scenario, you're buying these guys as your QB3 and you're playing them during the bye weeks and during the injuries that happen throughout the year. So I think all of these players are fine, good, not great, older assets that are probably going to be replaced here within the next 2 years. So there you have it. That is my top 30 quarterback rankings for Dynasty Fantasy Football right now as we head into the Dynasty Fantasy Football offseason. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, do me the favor and hit that like button. If you found something entertaining or actionable in today's video, that is the best way to show us some love and show us some support. Also, if you want to subscribe to the channel, I strongly encourage you to do that. More videos coming out all off season long, trying to get to 5K subscribers, and we can only do that with your help. So if you like the content, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Last but not least, go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description. In there, talking fantasy football 24/7, 365, a dope community of people. I think almost 300 people in that community at this point, there to help you guys with your fantasy football teams, answer questions, chat, join new leagues, do all of that good stuff. Go join it. Like I said, free to join, so there is no risk in doing that. And with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next video. But until then, peace out.